beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Well, greetings and good afternoon and welcome back as always. Thank you all so much for joining me today. So Trump said 4 days ago that land strikes in Venezuela will, quote, start very soon. We'll be starting to stop them by land also, end quote. Trump said of alleged Venezuelan drug traffickers, quote, the land is easier, but that's going to start very soon, end quote. Will the land, in fact, be easier? And if the invasion is by land, who will be the first to suffer? What does this mean for the Cimarron or Afro-Venezuelan community? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each episode or program, my guests and I connect the dots between the current events and the broader historical context in which they occur. Let's take a quick look at some of today's headlines. The Washington Post reports Hegseth, citing fog of war, says he learned of survivors hours after the strike. The defense secretary's remarks were the most extensive public accounting yet of his involvement in the military's lethal attack on alleged drug smugglers on September 2nd. Hegseth said yesterday that, quote, a couple of hours, end quote, passed before he was made aware of a September military strike he authorized and watched live, required an additional attack to kill 2 survivors, further trying to distance himself from the incident now facing congressional inquiry. Folks, very simply, this is all a ruse. This is subterfuge. This is obfuscation, prestidigitation. It's an attempt at sleight of hand. How about a flat-out lie? What was the original report? Hegseth gave a spoken directive according to 2 people that have the direct knowledge. The order was to kill everybody, one of them said. Did he watch the video? How much of the video did he watch? None of that matters. He ordered the U.S. military special operations forces to murder unarmed civilians who were posing no armed threat to this country. Once the boat was disabled and survivors were seen floating in the ocean under international law and the laws of war, the United States, the ship on the scene, was obligated to save the survivors, not fire another missile and murder them at sea. The alleged traffickers posed no imminent threat of attack against the United States. They weren't even armed, as the Trump administration has tried to argue. Here's a bit of video of Pete Hegseth stumbling through the lie.
To make that call. Now, the first couple of strikes, as you would, as any leader would want, you want to own that responsibility. So I said, I'm going to be the one to make the call after getting all the information and make sure it's the right strike. That was September 2nd. I watched that first strike live. As you can imagine, at the Department of War, we got a lot of things to do. So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. A couple of hours later, I learned that that commander had made which he had the complete authority to do, and by the way, Admiral Bradley made the correct decision to ultimately sink the boat and eliminate the threat. He sunk the boat, and eliminated the threat. And
Folks, that's just flat out wrong. And before that piece with Hegseth, all Donald Trump did was sit there and say, oh, I didn't know nothing about it. I didn't know nothing about it. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes. He sounded like Dr. Seuss. 1 strike, 2 strike, 3 strike, blue strike. And Hegseth, what did he do? Trump passed it to Hegseth. Hegseth has now passed it to Bradley. Nothing but a lie. 2 members of the West Virginia National Guard were shot in an ambush-style attack in Washington, D.C. last Wednesday afternoon. The suspect, who is believed to have acted alone, has been identified by the administration as Manuel Salcedo, an Afghan national who entered the United States in 2021. Here's some video of D.C. prosecutor Jeanine Pirro talking yesterday about Mr. Salcedo. Let's roll the video.
And the fact that we don't have a rap sheet on this guy, as if he was born in the Bronx or in the district, should tell us that, he is clean. We have no idea who he is. He has no connections to the community. The
Folks,
crime is one that we believe we will be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's a lie. Jeanine Pirro knows exactly who this man is. He served in what's known as the CIA-led Zero Unit in Afghanistan. The man accused of shooting 2 National Guard soldiers blocks from the White House served in the CIA-backed Zero Units in Afghanistan, a paramilitary group that carried out secret raids against suspected terrorists and U.S. enemies as part of the CIA's counterterrorism program. In order to work in that capacity, he was, contrary to the Trump administration's lie, contrary to Pirro's lie, thoroughly vetted multiple times. This is not, as reported by the Raw story, a case of radicalization, as Pirro wants you to believe. Here's what's being reported. After the war ended in Afghanistan, Salcedo was relocated to the U.S. He lived in Bellingham, Washington, after he immigrated. He was unable to establish long-term gainful employment and unable to provide for his family. He has 5 children. And he reached out to the government for assistance and was basically ignored. Despite his legal status, his mental health deteriorated. He became isolated. He became disillusioned, and then got in a car, drove across country, and committed these heinous acts. This is not a matter of radicalization. This is a matter of the American government failing to support Afghan individuals that sided with the United States in trying to overthrow the Taliban. That's what this is about. Context is very important here. I'm not condoning his actions, but truth does matter. Our veteran hospitals and our American streets are full of forgotten and ignored veterans. And Mr. Salcedo has now fallen victim to the same process that so many of the American veterans have fallen victim to. This is a part of the tragedy that Pirro and others are choosing to ignore. And finally, Wickoff and Kushner hold 5-hour meeting with Putin, no sign of breakthrough. They held a 5-hour talks with President Putin and his advisors in the Kremlin yesterday to discuss a potential peace plan to the end of the war, but the meeting ended with no sign of breakthrough. Folks, CNBC and other outlets have a headline: Putin threatens Europe with war if it wants one, as Ukraine peace talks falter. Peace talks held between the U.S. and Russia failed to deliver a breakthrough, with Russian President Putin ahead of the discussions doubling down on threats towards Europe, saying Russia was ready for war with the continent. Folks, here's what Putin actually said. Quote, "We are not planning to fight with Europe, but if Europe suddenly starts a war with us, we are ready right now," end quote. Let me translate that as we would say it on the corner. Don't start nothing, won't be nothing. That's not a threat. That's not Putin threatening to go to war with Europe. That's Putin telling Donald Trump, if you're dumb enough to do this, I will handle this business. That's what he's saying. Again, folks, context. This boils down to what Rubio said. It's a proxy war between the United States and Ukraine against Russia. The United States has lost. After being lied to twice, as admitted by German Chancellor Angela Merkel during the Minsk Accords process, Putin is making it very clear: I'm not going through this so-called peace agreement process with you again. It's a ruse. It's a lie. Trump is simply looking for a face-saving way out of this failure, out of this catastrophe, and Putin won't give him one. Putin's basically saying, look, you started this war. I kicked your butt. Surrender, or I'm going to continue to insert foot in ass. It's just that simple. On today's program, the issue before us, the Economic Times reports Trump-Venezuela tensions rise. What Venezuela's military and militias could do if the U.S. attacks. Of great concern to me is, if the U.S. were to attack, who would actually wind up taking the brunt of the attack and who would wind up suffering? My guests are Professor Manuel Salcedo, a Cimarron from the Afro-descendant movement of Venezuela. Professor Salcedo, welcome to the show. Professor, are you with us? Well, there we go. Professor Salcedo, welcome.
Welcome, great. Thank you for inviting the meeting today. Is I honor feeling you invite me and you making now about talking speaking the situation in Venezuela.
Thank you. We're also joined by Delaney Leonard, a community organizer and a fiber artist based out of D.C., Washington, D.C. She primarily engages with work centered on building an anti-imperialist and decolonial consciousness in the community. Delaney, welcome to the show.
Peace. How are y'all?
We are well, thank you. We're
also
joined by
Thank you.
Editor at Venezuelan Analysis, and Ricardo is joining us and is also going to help translate for Professor Salcedo. Ricardo, thank you.
Hey, Wilmer, it's great to be back.
So let me ask Professor Salcedo this question first. If the United States decides to invade Venezuela, I've been told that the Afro-Venezuelan the Afro-Venezuelan community will suffer the initial brunt of the attack. Ricardo, could you translate and for me,
Sí,
please?
la pregunta es si Estados Unidos, si Trump llega a decidir invadir a Venezuela, Wilmer ha escuchado que la comunidad afro-venezolana sería quien recibiría ese primer golpe. ¿Qué nos puede decir sobre eso?
¿Tú me estás escuchando, Ricardo? Ok.
Sí, te escucho.
Sí, la primera que recibiría el impacto de la guerra sería la población afro-venezolana, porque nos encontramos en toda la costa. Y la costa es la que está frente al mar Caribe.
Ajá, dame un chance para ir traduciendo. He says that indeed the Afro-Venezuelan community would bear the brunt of the first impact because they are mostly located on the coast that faces the Caribbean Sea.
Sin embargo, nosotros la población afrodescendiente se ha venido preparando para el posible escenario de la guerra.
Nevertheless,
pero además de eso, nosotros sabemos, nosotros sabemos también que vamos a ser los primeros, porque en la zona donde nosotros vivimos llegan los buques de gasolina que abastecen a todo el país.
We also expect to bear its first impact because the areas where we live are also where the ships that bring gasoline for the entire country arrive, so it's a strategic point.
Además, también en la zona donde nosotros vivimos los afrodescendientes, que es Barlovento, ahí están las principales reservas de agua que alimentan a la ciudad capital, a Caracas.
And furthermore, Barlovento, which is an area close to Caracas, which is an Afro-Venezuelan area, is also home to the water deposits that supply Caracas.
Y un último elemento es que Barlovento une a los dos extremos del país, al extremo este y al extremo oeste. Entonces, si atacan a Barlovento, van a incomunicar al país.
And Barlovento is also critical because it's a crucial passageway connecting the east and the west of the country. So, if it's attacked, it can fracture the country in two.
Nosotros ya sabemos la responsabilidad que tenemos en caso de que se presente la invasión. Ahora también, nosotros sabemos que posiblemente, según los análisis que hemos hecho, ellos no ingresen por tierra, sino que ellos van a hacer el ataque aéreo.
So we are fully aware of our responsibility, but at the same time, we are not expecting a land invasion, but rather an aerial attack.
Delaney, let me ask you, you are a crucial part of the Hands Off Venezuela campaign. If you could, Delaney, explain to the audience what that specifically involves and how can people support it?
Yeah, so essentially, myself and my comrades at African Medical and Political Solidarity here in DC, we've been doing a lot of work around trying to raise this issue of hands off Venezuela, and in particular, hands off the African people in Venezuela. As was just said, these are communities that are primarily living on the coast. And, there are approximately 15,000 United States troops that have been mobilized into Caribbean waters and off the coast of Venezuela. The world's largest warship has also been mobilized. We were also just talking about airstrikes. There have been 21 airstrikes on fishing boats in the Caribbean and in the waters around Venezuela. And all of this is kind of happening under, the White House's justification that this is a war on narcotics, and that, these people pose a threat to us here in the United States, and thus, an invasion is necessary. But the reality of the situation is we understand that the United States is trying to invade Venezuela, not because it cares about American people's safety or even the safety of the Venezuelan people, but because the United States desires regional control of the Americas. Venezuela is an extremely strategic point because it possesses the world's largest oil reserves. Oil is an extremely, extremely profitable profitable resource, and one that the United States intends to capitalize on as much as it can. And so the ruling class is in pursuit of Venezuela, not only for its resources, but also because of its socialist government and of its socialist democracy, and the example that that sets for colonized people around the world. There's this narrative and this rhetoric that Maduro is a dictator, but the reality is, since Chavez was elected in 1999, Venezuela has demonstrated itself as really one of it conducts some of the world's most advanced elections to ensure that fraud does not occur. And to kind of see an example of that as part of the work that we've been doing with this Hands Off Venezuela campaign, we did a screening of one of our comrades' films, Venezuela Rising, which actually follows the referendum that happened most recently, and kind of demonstrates democracy in action. So all of this work that we're doing, it's not only because we understand that the United States is, trying to continue its imperial interests, its colonial interests, and that impacts African people in the diaspora abroad, but that is also impacting our communities here, because as the United States invests into war abroad, it's disinvesting into our communities here. Instead of investing into educational resources, food resources, SNAP was just cut for about a month, and that severely impacted people's access to food. So instead of investing in social programs like that serve the people's needs, the United States is focused on, international occupation, international domination, while simultaneously occupying us as well. We understand here in DC, the National Guard has been occupying the city for months now. And that National Guard is part of the same military apparatus that is being used abroad in Venezuela, in Cuba, in other places in the Caribbean, in Haiti. So, with this work, we're trying to really point out the issue that this is an attack on African people abroad, but also on African people here. And the struggle that is occurring in Venezuela is a struggle that we should care about here. And especially as African people living in the heart of global and world colonialism, this is something that we need to be doing everything in our power to raise as an issue, and also to, disrupt the process of this machine, disrupt the process of militarism. So that's sort of the situation on kind of why we've been doing this work.
Ricardo, you were with us yesterday, and I said, I'll probably see you tomorrow. And I was joking when I said that, but thank you so much for joining us. Just in the span of 24 hours, have you seen anything that is giving you greater concern, or are things basically as they were as we were talking yesterday?
Hey, Wilmer, it's great to be back. I wasn't expecting that. Skipper Bailey told me that they were doing a great show, and then said, Wilmer Leon is hosting. Oh, funny. I was just talking to him. So it's great to be here. Let me just add something, because Delaney was making some great points about the impact on Venezuelans, on the Africans in the United States, but also I think we also have to keep in mind that there's a threat of a war right now in Venezuela, but there's also been a war going on. I mean, if we're talking about the economic terrorism that the United States has unleashed on Venezuela for, conservatively speaking, 10 years, one of the consequences that it had, because it hurt the Venezuelan economy so much, is that it put an end to programs like PetroCaribe. And PetroCaribe was, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable international cooperation solidarity programs, in that it supplied gasoline and oil to Caribbean nations at not necessarily affordable prices, but affordable conditions. And that in turn would allow them to free themselves from dependency in the United States in order to chart a more independent path forward. So it's an impact on many levels that we always have to keep in mind. And coming back to the present, you were saying in the beginning that Trump said land strikes would follow soon. And I had a deja vu, because he first said it on September the 30th. So we've been at this imminent threat for a long time, and there have been constant flights from US fighter jets and bombers here close to Venezuelan territory. This morning, again, a pair of of bombers came and flew by. I mean, in a way, that's their effort to test Venezuelan capabilities and defenses, but it's also, psychological warfare, keeping Venezuelan forces constantly on edge. But at the same time, I don't usually like to make these kinds of generalizations, but I think Venezuelans have a remarkable sense of humor. So yesterday there was an announcement of a press conference, and people were saying it's either going to be an attack on Venezuela or a new cryptocurrency. And in the end, it was neither. It was, Trump didn't seem to be fully awake. So it was mostly useful for, seeing Hexet trying to pass off the blame for a war crime to an admiral, even though, as you were rightfully pointing out in the beginning, he will not get off the hook. And I think this is also a sign, the fact that this story has come out is also a sign of how much he is despised by the very own military brass that he's supposed to command. But when it comes to the situation here on the ground, I think we are still at the same level of, let's say, constant tension and trying to figure out what's coming next.
Thank you. Professor Salcedo, and again, Ricardo, if you could please translate. You are part of the Cimarron community from the Afro-descendant movement of Venezuela. A lot of people don't really even realize the size of the Afro-Venezuelan community. How significant is it?
La pregunta, usted es parte del movimiento Cimarrón, que es parte de la comunidad afro-venezolana. Mucha gente no tiene noción de la dimensión de la población afro-venezolana aquí en el país, entonces si usted puede explicar brevemente la importancia de esta población.
¿Me escucha?
Sí, adelante.
Bueno, en el año 2010 se hizo un censo que arrojó que la población afrodescendiente no se autorreconocía, y la que se autorreconocía era del 0,7% para el año 2010. Producto de todo el trabajo que hizo el movimiento, hoy en día representamos el 49% de la población venezolana que se autorreconoce.
Déjame traducir. There have been census over time because there's also a matter of people identifying themselves as Afro-descendants. So part of the work of Cimarron groups like the one Professor Salcedo is in is to boost that recognition. And according to the most recent census, 49% of the population identifies as Afro-descendant.
Wow. I didn't know it was that large.
Que no tenía idea que era tanto. 49%.
Wow. So,
sí, eso es un trabajo producto de todo un hilo histórico que hemos venido construyendo, producto de todos los procesos históricos preindependentistas que hemos vivido en el país. Un caso, un ejemplo, José Leonardo Chirino, antes de Bolívar, fue uno de los precursores.
Well, why don't you go ahead and translate what we've got so far?
So he's saying that this is the result of a process of recognition of a thread of historical episodes where Afro-Venezuelan communities and people were protagonists. And he was mentioning one example. José Leonardo Chirinos was a Cimarron leader in the late 18th century who led the rebellion in Western Venezuela, and this was one of the precursors of Venezuelan independence. This was roughly 20 years before Venezuelan independence.
I think we're having some trouble with his link. So let me ask you one more question, Ricardo, and then we'll come back to you, Delaney. Delaney mentioned that this is an attack on African people abroad. Is it viewed in Venezuela as such, seeing as if there is a land invasion, that the Black community in Venezuela will bear the brunt of the initial invasion? Is it being viewed in that context?
I don't think, at least from the discourse and the general understanding, it's not framed as such. It's framed as an attack on, the country itself, its people, its sovereignty, and so on. But at the same time, there has been a concerted effort, which I think makes a lot of sense, to recall Venezuela's, hundreds of years of history of facing off against foreign occupiers and foreign empires. So going back to the Spanish Empire and then everything that came after that, and in doing so, recognizing the role played by the indigenous communities, the Cimarrones, throughout history and throughout the multiple rebellions, and also against the U.S.-backed oligarchy. So, it's possibly more pronounced in these Afro-Venezuelan communities, but at least in terms of the mainstream official discourse, let's call it like that, it's kind of a broader perspective of where we come from as a nation, our credentials in terms of resisting against foreign empires, and how we're supposed to.
We have Professor Salcedo back. In terms of the militia, we've been hearing a lot about the Venezuelan militia. What role does the Cimarron community play, and are they ready for the fight?
Ajá, la pregunta, profesor, que se ha escuchado mucho sobre la milicia, y entonces, ¿qué papel juega el pueblo cimarrón en la milicia y si están preparados para la lucha?
Las milicias, acabamos de salir de un proceso de reestructuración de las bases de la revolución bolivariana. Estamos saliendo en este proceso. El día de ayer, justamente, el presidente Nicolás juramentó los comandos de bases integrales bolivarianos. Esos son comandos que operan en cada calle. Estamos organizados en cada calle. Y de cada calle sale una milicia bolivariana. Cada comando también está integrado por una milicia bolivariana. Pero también, además de eso, las milicias bolivarianas se conforman en comunidades, y de las comunidades, por supuesto, salen los estados de las comunidades. Es una red completa, integral, organizada de manera orgánica para la defensa, ¿no? Porque además de eso se cumplen varias funciones dentro de las milicias. Las milicias cumplen un rol de protección para la protección al adulto mayor, protección a los jóvenes, y además, por supuesto, en el escenario que se nos está planteando, nos estamos preparando para eso.
Okay, so he was explaining that there has been a process that has been led by the Socialist Party and the government to restructure the organization from the grassroots. So now you have these new structures that are called regional and local commands, which are organized to the level of every street. And these structures also have a unit of the militia. So the militia itself begins from the most grassroots level, and then he was explaining that it forms a network, an organic network that reaches different levels. But he was also pointing out that the role of the militia is not just about fighting and defense. It also plays a role in the community in terms of social attention, ensuring that there's proper care for the elders and other services.
Ya logramos organizar 247,000 calles en el país, y esos 247,000 calles son 246,000 comandos integrales de base en defensa de la revolución.
So this structure has been organized, and it has been split into roughly 250,000 streets. So there are these grassroots units in each of these nearly 250,000 streets.
Delaney, you've also been very involved in the politics and in support of efforts to help Cubans. Give us 2 or 3 similarities. I tell people all the time, we have a tendency to look at a lot of these events as though they occur in a vacuum, never really understanding never really understanding the broader historical context in which so many of these events take place. So what we're seeing happening in Venezuela is what has been transpiring in Cuba and vice versa, and Haiti as well.
Yeah, so I can definitely speak more specifically to Cuba, in terms of the similarities. But I would say that, what it was mentioned earlier by Ricardo that, economic warfare has been in play in Venezuela for, at least 10 years. And this is something that we also see with Cuba. The United States has imposed over 60-year, the world's longest economic blockade ever imposed on another country. The United States has been doing this to Cuba since, the start of their revolution, essentially in 1959. I want to say that sanctions officially started in 1962. But essentially the same tactics are being used in Cuba that are being used in Venezuela. Another similarity that we have to talk about, which is also connected to the reason for why the United States is even imposing these barriers onto these countries, is that, these countries are they both undergone socialist revolutions. They both are trying to create a new world order in which colonized people, in which people can, live autonomously and are not living under systems of domination and extraction, based on your ability to produce capital for the ruling class. And they set examples. And that example is a direct threat to the existence and the legitimacy of the United States. If people are able to see an alternative that works so well, because, we can talk about things like, the universal free healthcare in Cuba. We can talk about things like their education system. We can talk about all these different ways in which the Cuban socialist system is able to meet the needs of the people. And there are ways in which it cannot, and that's due to, in many ways, the blockade that has been imposed on them. But essentially, the United States is incapable of leaving either of these countries alone. It is incapable of allowing either of these countries to have sovereignty, because they pose a direct threat to the colonial apparatus that the United States is at the center of. So I would say that those are major similarities that we can point to for sure.
Ricardo, I'm going to ask you this question, then I'm going to pose the same question to Professor Salcedo. When you read Western press relative to Cuba, relative to Venezuela, and Cuba as well, but relative to Venezuela, they personalize the attack. Maduro is a strong man. Maduro is a dictator. They vilify the president. I have been saying, and in fact, I think we have even talked about on this show, that the Venezuelan people see this in the context of the revolution, not in the context of, do I like Maduro or don't I like Maduro? Does that question make sense? And if you could respond, how do people feel about the president?
Let me put the question to Professor first, because he won't, and then I'll complement whatever he says.
Okay.
Profesor, la pregunta es, en los medios occidentales es muy común que el tema de Venezuela se personalice. Se habla de Maduro y hay un gran esfuerzo por demonizar a Maduro, y en eso se olvida la naturaleza colectiva de la revolución. Entonces, ¿qué nos puedes decir al respecto de eso?
Go ahead, Professor.
Adelante.
No, repíteme la pregunta. Repeat question, please.
Sí, él preguntaba que en los medios occidentales es muy común que el tema se personalice alrededor de Maduro. Entonces, se habla de Venezuela y se habla solamente de Maduro, que es un dictador, que es autoritario, y con eso se oculta la naturaleza colectiva de una revolución. Entonces, ¿qué nos puede decir al respecto?
Sí. el gobierno de Estados Unidos ha tratado de enfocar que el problema es Maduro. El pueblo venezolano tiene conciencia que el problema no es Maduro. Aquí estamos convencidos plenamente que esta es la vía que estamos construyendo para ser libres. Y es una idea que viene no desde Maduro, no viene desde Chávez, sino que viene de los procesos históricos de que Bolívar, como libertador de 5 naciones, sembró en los venezolanos y venezolanas. Aquí el problema no es...
So he's saying that the United States government has tried to frame this illusion that Maduro is the problem, but Venezuelan people are fully aware and fully conscious that Maduro is not the problem, because they are and they believe to be on this path towards liberation. And this is an idea that does not come from Maduro. It does not even come from Chavez. It is the product of collective historical processes going back at least to Bolivar and the independence struggle. Adelante.
Sí, reconocemos que el presidente Maduro no ha moralizado y además le ha dado continuidad al proyecto. Le ha dado continuidad al proyecto bolivariano. Y que ha sido muy valiente, porque el presidente Nicolás Maduro, la situación no ha sido muy fácil, la que ha vivido. Muy dura ha sido, el ataque ha sido más fuerte que al mismo presidente Chávez. Pero yo creo que ejemplo de dignidad que ha dado el presidente Nicolás Maduro, nosotros lo emulamos y lo reconocemos. Entonces, que esté claro el gobierno de Estados Unidos, el problema no es Maduro. En caso supuesto que Maduro no llegue a estar, esto va a continuar. Esto va a continuar, la revolución va a continuar. Porque aquí lo que ellos van a querer pelear contra la idea, y la idea es imposible desaparecer.
So he's explaining that he recognizes that Maduro has brought continuity to this Bolivarian process, and he also gives Maduro a lot of credit for his bravery and his dignity in facing this incredible amount of attacks. In some sense, you could argue that he has faced more attacks than Chavez himself. But the United States government should understand that this is not about Maduro, and even if for some reason Maduro at some point is no longer present, the revolutionary process is going to continue.
In your thoughts, Ricardo? You wanted to add to the answer?
I think you pretty much summed up everything. But I just remembered when Chavez was doing his final campaign around 2012, he had a very beautiful slogan which said, I am no longer Chavez. You all of you are Chavez. So it goes to show, I think when whether it's the U.S. government or the corporate media, whenever they try to do this thing of just singling out someone, I feel that this is a projection of their own shortcomings. And when you see, for example, these ridiculous cabinet meetings where everyone is just tripping over each other to praise Trump, it just shows that there is no real project, there is no ideology. It's just, serving the corporate plutocracy and serving their own interests. And that's why perhaps it's so hard to understand a revolutionary process, whether that's Venezuela or Cuba, which, as Delaney was saying, has been under this economic terrorism for at least 60 years. So what Salcedo was saying at the end, you cannot kill this idea. This quote has been echoed by many different revolutionary leaders. And that's what also makes revolutions endure. I mean, when you think about everything that Venezuela has gone through and you look at it from afar, you can ask yourself, how is it possible that this revolutionary process remains alive? And it remains alive precisely because it was a genuine process. It planted these deep roots that then gave it enough strength to endure all these battles that it has had to endure and the battles that are still to come.
The battles that are still to come. Jonathan Soul, thank you for that super sticker and your comments. connecting you all with brothers and sisters in Venezuela, and context for me is always so important. And as Madhu agrees with you as well. Delaney, same question to you. When you read the Washington Post, when you want, if they give you an article about Venezuela, they're going to reference Venezuela's dictator, Nicolas Maduro. If they're talking about Russia, it's going to be Russia's dictator, Vladimir Putin. And so, do you see the same vilification effort? Your thoughts, Delaney?
I would say absolutely we can see the same vilification effort, because the reality is, as much as this empire seems so intimidating and vast and advanced, they use the same tactics over and over and over and over again. Earlier it was brought up, the psychological warfare that's happening in Venezuela of, everybody's on edge. Nobody knows what's coming next. And that was making me think about how, in occupied Palestine and Gaza, a lot of folks were saying that, you just hear this constant buzzing of the drones. You just hear this constant, there's this tension, and it leaves you sort of stagnant. It leaves you unable to do anything because you're so trapped in that moment. And I'm thinking about how, Israel is another colonial settler colony that is, directly in cahoots and funded and supported by the United States. And we're seeing the same tactics being used. We were talking about the economic sanctions, same tactics being used. So when it comes to this vilification of leaders, whether that's, Maduro, whether that's, Fidel, whether that's any sort of leader that is willing to, push beyond and not sort of take a knee and capitulate to colonialism, that becomes an enemy of the United States. I'm also thinking of another example. I'm thinking about Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso and the vilification that we see of him. Right. Earlier in the year, Jennifer Langley was saying, we need to go in and we need to, go in and instill democracy in Burkina Faso, essentially, because, Ibrahim Traore is hoarding gold and, is essentially trying to frame this man as this huge major villain. Right. And, Jennifer Langley is a Black man. This is an African person. So we're seeing, the representation of colonialism, the representation of imperialism on a Black face. And coming back to Venezuela, it makes me think of what's happening now, because, we're talking about how this is going to initially impact, these African communities on the coast. But we also need to talk about who are the soldiers that are actually going to be conducting this. And, considering the fact that, and I looked this up, but the Department of Defense estimates that about 1 in 5 enlisted service members are Black. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of Black people that are in the military. I'm sure every single one of us knows somebody in our family or adjacent to us that has somebody that is in the military that is an African person. So the reality is, time and time again, being shown with General Langley, we're being shown that right now with what's happening with these troops being stationed in the Caribbean, is that, African people in this country are being used as pawns for colonialism and neo-colonialism. And I think that it's really important that we understand that, and we understand the connections that these things have to Venezuela, because when aggression like this is impeding, it is our responsibility to resist. It is our responsibility to refuse to be made, the pawns of the White House, the pawns of, global, capitalism and white supremacy. And so that's why, it's so important that we can recognize this vilification of Maduro for what it is. It's just another scheme used by colonizers to try to sort of pull the wool over our eyes and make us consent to violence abroad, the same way that, we're forced to consent to violence domestically. So to go back to the question, I 100% think it's vilification. And of course it is, because, the sort of the colonial powers, they don't have new tactics. It's the same tactics. They evolve, but ultimately we can look at history and we can compare that to what's happening now and understand, what it is that our task is.
Professor Salcedo.
Can I just add a
Sure.
quick point? Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. I mean, Delaney made this great point, and I think we always have to bring up Palestine. There's this quote, and there's a documentary by John Pilger that said precisely Palestine is still the issue. And when you look at revolutionary processes like Venezuela and Cuba, I think one of the things that sets them apart from other, let's say, progressive efforts in the continent is the fact that on issues like Palestine, they haven't been afraid to stand on principle, even though it has led to backlash. So, for example, Che Guevara went to Gaza in the early 1950s or 60s, sorry. And Chavez was also very adamant, and he has this very famous quote where he says, damn to hell the state of Israel. So there are issues where you are not just going to try and conciliate and find common ground with the US and with this global colonialist project if you are going to stand on principle and be a true revolutionary project.
Let's ask Professor Salcedo the same question to give us some compare and contrast between the U.S. Economic and threatening military attack on Venezuela and what's going on in Palestine.
Profesor, una pregunta, si puedes hablar de las similitudes y diferencias entre lo que Estados Unidos está haciendo en contra de Venezuela, tuvimos a nivel económico las medidas coercitivas unilaterales por un lado, ahorita las amenazas militares y los paralelos con lo que está pasando en Palestina.
Ese es el escenario que queremos evitar. Nosotros con nuestra diplomacia de paz apostamos, por supuesto, a la paz. Es el primer planteamiento. Porque sabemos que dentro de una guerra hay mucha gente que se sacrifica. Sabemos que para poner las cosas en su contexto, es una agresión lo que estamos viviendo. Es una agresión de cuarta generación, lo que estamos viviendo en este momento los venezolanos. Mucho más aún con lo que sucedió, que un presidente como Trump se atreva a sancionar y a suspender el espacio aéreo y que acá no puedan aterrizar en este momento aviones con vuelos internacionales. Tenemos compatriotas que están varados en Europa y parte de Latinoamérica porque no han podido regresar al país. Compatriotas que salieron a hacer cualquier cosa, cualquier actividad. Entonces, el paralelismo está, ese paralelismo siempre ha existido desde el momento que llegó el presidente Chávez, cuando sufrimos el golpe de Estado, cuando tuvimos el paro petrolero, y además de eso, cuando los grupos terroristas en el año 2014 que murió el presidente Chávez, también pretendieron encender el país.
Ya, déjame
la única... Perfecto.
So he was saying that, I'm starting from the end of his answer to make more sense. So he's saying that from the moment when Chavez arrived and it became clear that Venezuela was not going to bow to U.S. interests, Venezuela went into the eye of the storm just like Palestine. And we're seeing what he called a fourth generation warfare with, all sorts of attacks starting from economic terrorism. And on all of that, you can see the parallels with Palestine. But at the same time, people are aware of just we have, because of what we've seen recently in Gaza, of the completely destructive potential of war. And that's what Venezuelan diplomacy, which anoints itself as a diplomacy for peace, is trying to avoid at all costs. Adelante.
Okay. Is there another? Does he have another point?
Sí, yeah, he was in the middle of the answer.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
Sí, además también existe el paralelismo porque desde que están bloqueándonos económicamente, ha habido situaciones muy difíciles para que ingresaran los alimentos. Hoy en día nosotros ya tenemos producción interna que abastece los alimentos. La única situación que nos está pasando y que también podemos establecer el paralelismo es que nuestra moneda ha sido atacada brutalmente y ha generado que el ingreso del venezolano disminuya, ¿no? Que algunas veces se hace muy difícil adquirir los bienes y servicios. Pero eso ha hecho que nosotros nos reinventemos y hemos venido construyendo una economía propia, una economía más sana, pensando, por supuesto, porque por eso es que nosotros somos una amenaza, por eso es que Obama nos decretó como amenaza, porque nosotros nos estamos convirtiendo en un ejemplo alternativo al modelo voraz, consumista que plantea los gobiernos imperialistas de los cuales han gobernado en Estados Unidos lamentablemente y no han respondido a los intereses del pueblo noble de Estados Unidos.
Okay, so he was complementing that another parallel you can draw with Palestine is in terms of the blockade that happens in many ways. He was mentioning in the first part of his answer that now Trump wants to unilaterally impose some kind of air blockade against Venezuela, and there has also been these economic measures that we were discussing a while ago for at least 10 years, and he was explaining how these measures have, or at their beginning, affected food supplies a lot, and that in turn led the country to focus its efforts in becoming more self-sufficient and reinventing itself. That's an expression that's used a lot in Venezuela. So he's summing up that this ability of finding solutions is also what made Obama declare Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. interests, because it's precisely betting on the construction of a model that's completely opposite to this capitalist model built on consumerism and neoliberalism that the United States and its allied governments have tried to impose all over the world.
Getting back to Delaney's point, and I'm going to ask Professor Sal. Oh, another point? He has another point?
Sí, adelante.
Sí, y un último elemento que también es válido hacer el paralelismo con Gaza, es que con el mismo bloqueo atentó contra la vida de muchos venezolanos, especialmente de las mujeres y los niños, que no tuvieron acceso a los medicamentos, a las medicinas para ser tratados. Aquí lo hicieron bloqueándonos económicamente y en Gaza lo hicieron con bombas. Ese es otro paralelismo que existe con Gaza.
And one final common point with Gaza, of course, with the respective distance, is that the imperialist onslaught has been particularly felt by women and children. In the case of Gaza, they were especially targeted, and in the case of Venezuela, when we talk about this economic terrorism, it had a much bigger impact, and this has been documented in several studies, in terms of the healthcare of women who, for example, could not access birth control, or children who suffered from malnutrition. So the imperialist wars always target these groups harder than the rest.
So one more question for him, and all three of you we'll close with this. We mentioned the blockade, and Delaney mentioned economic sanctions. And we've talked about on this show before that I've never known sanctions to work. That sanctions usually just encourage and reinforce a sense of nationalism. So if Professor Salcedo could give us some real practical examples of what's happening with the sanctions, and am I right that sanctions are really enhancing the nationalism as opposed to turning people against the government?
Sí, bueno, la última pregunta, Manuel, dice que en su experiencia las sanciones económicas nunca han funcionado y más bien al revés, como que terminan reforzando una sensación, un sentimiento de nacionalismo. Y entonces, si en el caso venezolano se te ocurren un par de ejemplos concretos de lo que ha sido el impacto y la respuesta a las sanciones, si estás de acuerdo con esta conclusión de que más bien han reforzado el sentimiento nacional.
Sí, sí, estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que ha dicho, pero también voy más allá. Ha unido al pueblo, eso ha cohesionado al pueblo y lo ha cohesionado en función de nuestro gobierno. Y además de eso, eso ha hecho que nosotros veamos una alternativa más allá de lo que en algún momento fue articular con el gobierno de Estados Unidos. Eso ha hecho que nosotros nos reinventemos desde lo económico, desde lo social y de lo político. O sea, nos estamos planteando ir y plantearnos algo distinto contra el orden establecido, contra el sistema establecido, el sistema de dominación establecido.
Yeah, so he's completely in agreement with you and in saying that the economic sanctions have brought the people together and generated more support in terms of finding economic, social, and political solutions to really create an alternative to this capitalist model that the US and others have been trying to impose.
Thank you, Professor Salcedo, for your time. And I'm going to ask each of you to do this, and we'll start with him. What's the one thing you want the audience to know today about what's happening or what is threatening to happen in Venezuela?
I think the one thing I would ask people is that they keep their eyes on Venezuela, because there's a tendency when you feel that nothing happens to just look away because it feels like nothing is going to take place. But this is a very serious threat, and no one can really predict what's going on in Trump's head. So for all the reasons that we have discussed throughout the program, all three of us and also you, Wilmer, you should oppose war on principle. You should oppose these imperialist aggressions on principle. But also Venezuela represents something else. I mean, in my opinion, and I'm not sure if this is universal, I think it's the most important revolutionary process of the 21st century because of what it meant domestically, because of what it meant in terms of regional integration. And the process has faced a lot of contradictions. I would perhaps add some nuance in terms of when we're talking about economic sanctions and the impact that they have. It's not so clear that it kind of linearly generates support, but there's still a very critical mass here in Venezuela that embraces socialism as a historical horizon, and having these concrete projects that counter US hegemony in the hemisphere is fundamental, even with all their contradictions.
And if you could ask Professor Salcedo his point, and then Delaney, we'll let you wrap it up.
Profesor, un último mensaje que quieres decir a la audiencia que nos está viendo.
Bueno, mi último mensaje es seguirle pidiendo al pueblo de Estados Unidos, al pueblo como ustedes que ustedes representan, que sigan luchando en las calles contra el nacionalismo, contra estos enemigos de la humanidad que en este momento están en la Casa Blanca. Y esa lucha que ustedes den en las calles, nosotros también la vamos a acompañar desde acá, desde Venezuela, desde el Caribe, desde Latinoamérica, para nosotros construir un mundo mejor. Es importante el apoyo que ustedes nos den.
He was saying that it's fundamental that the people in the US, the common people such as yourselves, continue to fight and continue taking to the streets to oppose the fascism and the Zionism that has taken hold of the White House, and that this struggle is a common struggle with the struggle here in Venezuela, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and it's part of a general fight to build a better world.
Please, Ricardo, thank him for his time and let him know we'd love to have him back.
Manuel, muchas gracias por tu tiempo y sería un placer volver a contar contigo en otra ocasión.
The next time I'm speaking in English about the Venezuela. Yeah, I need to practice every day. I study English in university.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
See you soon, brother. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Delaney, your thoughts.
Well, I know you told us to only say one thing, but I have a
Well, I'll
couple.
give you two. I'll give you two.
Okay, so the first thing that I was going to say was just to go back really quickly to your question about sanctions and their effectiveness or ineffectiveness. I just wanted to say that something that's been kind of going through my head as we've been having this conversation was in regards to what Ricardo was saying earlier about how the revolution is going to continue whether or not, Maduro is in office or whatever. It is a process that is going to continue because it's ingrained into the social fabric of Venezuela. And I think that just kind of makes me think about how, kind of similar to what I was saying earlier about how, we kind of view the United States as this super huge global superpower, which it is, not to discount that. But at the same time, we also understand that it's not original. It's using the same tactics. But we also can kind of see how the United States thinks that it can, kind of bully the world into submission and that it has monopoly and authority over the world. But the reality is that revolutions such as the one in Venezuela, such as the one in Cuba, such as the one occurring in Burkina Faso, they're going to continue happening. Colonized people are going to continue rising up against their oppression. And those revolutions are going to maintain themselves because they're not based in domination. They're not based in exploitation. They're not based in extraction. They're based in a love for human life, in a love for wanting to create a world in which people can actually live, within their means and by their means and not have to sell themselves to a corporation in order to survive. And it just kind of makes me think about this fact that, capitalism does have an expiration date. And I think that that's something that we need to consistently remember in moments like this, where it feels like it's just endless war. We cannot let up our organization. We cannot let up our resistance because we understand that this has to come to an end at some point, and we need to be ready and prepared for that. And we need to also be in solidarity with people across the world as this is happening, because our revolution is not going to only be domestic, because the United States occupation is not only domestic, it's international, it's global. And so connecting with movements and struggles such as, what's happening with that Afro-descendant movement on the ground, they're organizing things like people's assemblies in their communities. They're doing things like drumming for peace and, doing cultural activities and things like that to sort of demonstrate their resilience. It's crucial that as African people here, we are connected to these struggles and we see them as our own. So kind of leading in from that into what I really think I would like for people to leave with is the fact that now that you have this understanding of Venezuela, you understand the ways that it is connected to our struggle here as African people. You understand the fact that when we consent to violence and war abroad, we consent to it domestically. We understand that the same military forces here in DC, the National Guard, that we see standing around, is part of the same military apparatus that's being mobilized off the coast. And if we understand all these things, we have a responsibility to continue to carry that knowledge forward and disrupt the narrative that the corporate media is trying to portray, not only about, this current war on narcotics, but about Venezuela, period, about, people suffering under this dictatorship, and, that somehow means that, now the United States has justification to invade and instigate a highly destructive war for pursuit of oil, for pursuit of profit. So I would say that, speak with those around you about this, and like what Ricardo said, like keep your eyes on Venezuela, stay informed about what's happening, because we need to continue to raise our community's consciousness around this issue so that we can collectively and effectively mobilize against the imperial forces here and try to stop the cogs of the machine from running. So I would just say that, what we've discussed today, it is real people's lives that are being impacted by this. It's a real attack on political sovereignty. It's a real attack on Latin America, on African people in the diaspora. And for all of those reasons and so many more, we need to adamantly and clearly and loudly say hands off Venezuela, hands off African people in Venezuela. And I also, of course, always want to say free Africans everywhere, free colonized people everywhere. So that's what I would say is, make sure you pass this knowledge forward, figure out and identify ways that you can plug into the movement and into the struggle. If you would like to, stay updated on this, you can follow our Instagram, which is Amps Solidarity. And there, that's where you can kind of get informed on call to actions or other such related things. But yeah, That's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Delaney Leonard. Thank you very much. Ricardo Vaz, man, you stepped up, you stepped in, man. Thank you, thank you. You really made this what it was. Thanks, bro. I really appreciate it. And Professor Manuel Salcedo, thank you again, my dear brother. I really appreciate that, folks. Thank you all so much today for joining us here on Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. New show tomorrow, working on the guests, but trust me, in the words of the Moon Man, it's going to be a big one. And remember that this is where the analysis of history, politics, and culture converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.